Hi everybody, it's Claudia from Create with Claudia, and today I'm going to answer the question, what are some common mistakes that quilters make? And this is a tough one because sometimes some of the things on this list aren't going to really be, you may not consider mistakes, but I do. I'm not trying to start any arguments here or anything, but after quilting for 30 years, these are mistakes that I have found that I did when I first started out, so a lot of beginner mistakes, but also mistakes that I still make, and unfortunately I still make a lot of them. So why don't we get started? The first one is rushing. Do not rush when you make a quilt, and I know that's really hard, especially for me. I am a rusher. You can ask my teenage daughter that. I'm always rushing her to do things. It's just the way I am, I can't help it. But when I'm making a quilt, I really need to take a deep breath, sit back, and plan it out and work on it nice and slowly. Because if I don't, I inevitably make a lot of mistakes. So number one, that's more not really a mistake, but well, I guess it is if you're rushing. But anyway, so don't rush, take your time. The next mistake is not being organized. Okay, now you're talking to somebody here, or I am the queen of organization, at least my family thinks so. And especially in quilting, I love staying organized. If I don't, especially if I'm doing an intricate pattern, it is so easy to get mixed up and sew something together incorrectly. So to avoid any long nights of seam ripping, that kind of thing, and that not rushing plays into that too. Take your time, plan it out, and stay organized. And there's all kinds of ways to stay organized. The next one is people cut incorrectly. And this is a tough one, especially for beginners and depending on what kind of equipment you have. And this one I'm going to show you. I have an example. I didn't have examples of the first ones, but I'm going to show you these fur on there. These are two squares. They're both supposed to be the same size, but you can see, hopefully you can see, that the white one is a little bit bigger. It's about 1/8 of an inch bigger. That does not sound like a lot, but believe me, when you're making a quilt with a lot of pieces, those little 1/8 of inches add up, and at the end of maybe a row or something, you will notice a big difference. So take that time and cut your pieces correctly. Another one, and this is a block I did recently for a challenge, and this is one I'm also guilty of quite often, pressing too hard, especially if I've had a bad day or I'm in a grumpy mood. You just want to take that iron and just press the living daylights out of a block, or even out of just fabric. It is amazing how much, if you press too hard, the fabric will warp and stretch out, and then it's really hard to get it back into shape. So take some time, just use as light as you can to touch. I know sometimes it's hard to get those wrinkles out, but you might need a little steam. It all depends on the kind of fabric you're using, but just press lightly. Use that light touch. You'll appreciate it in the long run. Another one is following pattern directions. And I don't always I don't use a lot of patterns in my work. I sort of like to make my own. But this, for example, this one was a pattern that I had gotten for a quilt along I'm working on. This is somebody else's pattern. It's a really pretty block. But when I first did it, I just thought I knew exactly what I was doing, and this center block was flipped over this way, and of course it was wrong. And that's because I didn't take the time to read the directions. And sometimes directions, are easy to follow, sometimes they're a little bit harder, but honestly I just was rushing through it and I thought I knew it all, and I didn't. So again, I had to tear it all apart and fix it. And this is a heartbreaker for a lot of people, and this is a big mistake, especially if you don't follow patterns that have fabric requirements. It's not buying enough fabric, and this is the example of this one. I think, to this day, this is my most favorite fabric I've ever bought in my life. I don't even remember who made it. I don't know what the pattern was called, but I bought it years ago, and I could still look at that today. I don't know what it is about this fabric. It's just so beautiful. Unfortunately, when I bought it, I didn't have anything in mind for it, and I still do that, but I only bought, I think it was like 2 yards of it, and then I had these grand plans of making this huge queen size quilt using this fabric throughout. And of course, I didn't have nearly enough. I had enough to make these few little medallions. I think there's 6 in this queen size quilt, and then I just had to build other blocks around it. You can see I made it. I think it's called the Summer Wind block, and I had to play with a lot of different scrap fabrics. Don't get me wrong, I still love this quilt, and I just regret to this day, this is my one fabric that I really regret not buying more of. And it's I mean, this was many years ago, so I'm sure this doesn't exist anymore. But so always make sure to buy enough fabric, and if you're going by a pattern, whoever pattern you're using should tell you how much fabric you need. And honestly, because I don't want to get burned, and if I really like the fabric, I'll probably buy a little bit extra. And I know fabric's expensive, so of course that does come into play a lot, but just don't regret it down the line like I do with this quilt. Okay, another one, and this is for beginners. Oh, these quilts are heavy. Is starting simply, or not starting simply is the mistake. And that is very easy to do. So I'm going to show you the very first quilt I ever made. And honestly, I did not have a sewing machine. I didn't know how to quilt. I didn't know anybody that knew how to quilt. I bought a book and I taught myself. And I went out to the fabric store and bought fabric I thought was pretty. I didn't know anything about fabric. I just went to the quilting fabric section and bought these fabrics. And I did not start out simply. So I made this star. It's an 8-pointed star, which if you could have started with a harder block, it would be hard to find one. It has set-in seams. It has these 8 points that you had to join. Again, I was quilting by hand, so that made it a little bit harder. So I had to draw these templates out. This quilt took me like a year to make. Now, it is not the most beautiful quilt by any stretch of the imagination, but it has a very special place in my heart because it was the first one I made. However, I would not suggest starting with the hardest block you can find. Start simply. And with this quilt, I'll show you the other thing, and that is another mistake that people make, and this one's going to come with a caveat, but is choosing fabrics that are pretty much all the same value. This is supposed to be a sawtooth star, which is a fairly common block. Hopefully you can see it. But, well, actually you can't see it because I used so many fabrics with the same value. You can see, like, I used this sort of greenish gray and then this dark gray, and you don't even see those points, or these star points like that. Basically, all I can see when I look at this block, the first thing I see is this sort of beige part of it, and that's it. Everything else blends together. And that's a shame because you lose a lot of the sort of pow of a block like this. You can really, fabric is your friend, and definitely play with the values. There are all kinds of value guides out there. And one thing I have found, and I still do it today, is I tend to gravitate towards all one sort of medium value. And that did not work with this quilt. And you see where that star gets lost. Now, the caveat with this is these days, you do see some absolutely beautiful sort of low volume or monotone quilts. And they are real knockouts. And that's sort of my caveat to this whole thing, because depending on how you play with your color, you can have some really gorgeous sort of like one value or one tone quilt. But those are a little bit harder to put together, and you got to work at it. I would not do this again. Definitely would not do that again. Okay, and this is one that's going to cause, not really cause, but some people will not agree with, and a lot of people don't do and will never do. But I like to do it, and I do think it's a mistake not to do it. And that is not backstitching when you come to the end of rows. I think that's really important. If you've ever pieced blocks before, you know how those rows, how easily they can start unraveling and pulling apart. Now, I do not backstitch every single block that I do. However, I will backstitch, and of course here I did not do it, and this is what I wanted to show you. This is an older quilt before I started backstitching on every row, and you can see where it's unraveling, and you can see the batting coming out, or hopefully you can see that. So I'm just going to go back in there and whip stitch that and fix it. But basically, I think, and a lot of people don't agree with me, but I definitely think when you're coming towards if you're putting your blocks together in a quilt top, and you're coming to the end of a row, and it's going to butt up against or hit the binding or a sash, you should backstitch there. It's just another nice safeguard so you don't worry about your quilt unraveling in the long run, and make it nice and secure. And here's the other one that's going to start an argument, and I know it will. I am a firm believer in pre-washing fabrics, and I know not everybody is. And I understand that, and it's, again, to each his own. On these are just mistakes that I find that I've made, but this one I will honestly say I think is a mistake. This is a quilt I made for a show. It's all batiks. Actually, I made it for myself, but I entered it in a show, I should say. And for some reason, I did not pre-wash these. I think I was in the mood. They were all nice and crisp right from the store, and I didn't feel like washing them. And I just wanted to get started on my pattern. And there again plays rushing. So I didn't pre-wash them. Well, sure enough, and you probably can't see on the camera, all around the red, especially on this block, it's bled. There's red, it's got this real pale sort of red wash. And I have tried to get it out, I cannot. And the one thing I will say is when I entered it in the show, one of the judges commented that there was a lot of fabric bleeding, which drove me crazy because I'm usually really good about pre-washing. But that is my sort of argument for pre-washing. And again, it's totally up to you, but you can see, and especially for a quilt that you really want to, if you're doing like an all red and white quilt, you don't want that red fabric to bleed onto your white. So just maybe test some fabric that you're using. All right, the next one, let's see, is not squaring up blocks. And this is my poster child for mistakes, and I love this. I designed this quilt many years ago, I'm hoping you can see this. I don't know what I was thinking when I sewed this. I don't know how I was measuring. This comes to squares not being cut the same size, and not squaring up blocks. None of these blocks fit together on point. So I had to actually add, and I'm hoping you can see this, little strips of fabric on all the bottoms of every single block to make sure, so that I could have all equal and even sized blocks. Some are a little wonky. You can sort of see there, maybe that one's a little bit easier to see because of the pattern. Some were up to ½ an inch were off, and then some are maybe like this that are just 1/4 of an inch. This one here, let's see, you can see this one is just a teeny tiny bit off, so it was like 1/4 of an inch, maybe 1/8 of an inch. And then over on this side, it was ½ an inch. I mean, it was crazy. And it was a real lesson learned that I needed to square up my blocks and make sure I measured correctly, because theoretically I sewed these all the same, but when this quilt came together, it blew it out of the water. And even though I love this quilt and luckily it looks scrappy, from far you don't really see it, but if you look close you can definitely see where I had to fix all of those blocks. And that comes into play also not only with squaring up blocks, but consistent seam allowance. And that's what I was saying, is when I probably sewed this together, I probably must have used all kinds of seam allowances. Not sure what I was thinking, but if the pattern says, or if you're going to sew 1/4 inch, keep it 1/4 inch and keep it the same 1/4 inch the whole way through. It'll go together, your top will go together a lot more quickly and a lot better than if you just sort of use whatever you have on the machine that day. Consistent seam allowance, and that's a really important one. What I'm going to talk about is hanging quilts, and this is a very common mistake, and it's easy to make. This quilt is one I made for my mother and father years ago, sticking to the bottom one. And if you look at it, I don't know if you can see it, you can sort of see where it's faded. This was hung right in the sun. Now, I didn't really pay much attention to it when I gave it to them, and they hung it wherever they wanted to hang it. And honestly didn't think about it till years later when they took it down, and I looked at it and thought, oh my goodness, the sun is a horrible enemy of fabric and of quilts. And this is perfect case in point. This turquoise was like bright turquoise jewelry, and now it's like this faded sort of pale turquoise, and you can see where it's real blotchy, where you can see some of the original color and then the wrinkles, and it has totally, I mean, I keep the quilt just because I don't want to throw it out, but it really ruined the look of this quilt. You can see here it looks dusty, it looks faded, you can see some of that dark, that was like a dark coral, like a bright coral, and this was a bright purple, and again you can see where it's faded and blotchy. So don't hang those quilts in the sun. And it's easy to forget that. I have a wall in my house that's screaming for a quilt. It's this big empty spot, but I can't hang anything there because the sun hits it in the afternoon and it would ruin it. And I'm not going to do that. Okay, the next mistake is sometimes people use things that they shouldn't to hang a quilt. And I know there are all kinds of things to hang quilts, but this is something I did a long time ago. So it has fur in the sticky part. But you can see here, this was a quilt I bought, and I thought I'm just going to hang this up. So I got some hook and loop tape, where it's two-sided, and the one side I stuck to the wall, and the other side I took the sticky tape off the back and stuck it to the quilt, the fabric. Big no-no. Whenever I went to take it down a couple years later, I said I probably shouldn't hang it like that. Tried to take that sticky tape off, and this is what's left, and I cannot get it off. It's sticky, it's stained, and it's a real shame because this was a nice little quilt. In some spots it's torn a little bit, so watch what you hang your quilts with. Do a little studying before you just hang them up with anything. Another mistake quilters can make is marking with the wrong tools. And I am notorious for this, and this is the perfect example. This is a quilt I made my husband. Now, this is all cross-hatched, this is hand quilted, and a lot of work went into this quilt. And this I used that nice blue water-soluble marking pen, and you don't see a speck of it, perfect, or you don't see anything. But for some reason, and I don't know why, maybe I ran out of the blue pens, I decided to get fancy and use pencil. I do not know what I was thinking, and years later I've tried to get this out. Now, because it's hand quilted, I can't really scrub it or ruin the quilting, but hopefully you can see it. That is pencil mark that will not come out. So instead of my quilting, you can see this big sort of scallopy edge drawn in pencil. And my husband says he doesn't notice it, but I think any quilter that would come into my house and look at this would notice it, and it drives me crazy, and I've tried to fix it, but like I said, it is hand quilted and I don't want to ruin that quilting. So watch what you use. Now, okay. Another mistake that a lot of people make, especially when you're starting out or maybe you don't have a lot of supplies, when you're piecing together blocks, using a color of thread that doesn't match. Now, I'm not saying it has to be the perfect white on white, but if you look at this quilt that I made, and I hang it up every Christmas. I love this quilt, but I don't know, again, what I was thinking. I used dark green thread to piece. Well, of course, when you look at it, you see the dark green. It just shows you exactly where this quilt was pieced, and the whole goal of this piece was that you wouldn't see any piece of this quilt was that you wouldn't see any of my piecing. You would just see the white with this trees against it and the red triangles. Well, if you look, you can see everywhere. I'm hoping you can see that on the camera. It's just, you see the green lines, they pop out. So use the right color thread when you're making quilts. This one's a little dirty. Here you can see it over here a little bit more, and because that makes a big difference. And again, some of these mistakes I sort of notice more than other people, but this one I don't, even my daughter said, oh, what are those green lines? Well, there weren't supposed to be any green lines. So just think about when you use your the types of color thread you use. I always have a lot of white on hand, black on hand, depending on what I'm piecing together. And another really fail-safe one is a nice light gray, depending on that. Gray fits nicely, especially with multicolored fabrics. It's one of those that you don't, that's sometimes a nice one to use. And here again, you can see a little bit of bleeding. These red fabrics, red is the culprit always, a lot of times on fabric bleeding. And my last mistake, and I don't have an example of it here because it's tucked away in a box, is choosing the right batting. There are all kinds of batting, all kinds of materials, and I'm not going to get into those, but in general, you have a low loft and a high loft. High loft is the real puffy kind, and then low loft is this nice sort of thin kind. Especially wall hangings, and this is very general terms, and you can use whatever batting you want. But as a general rule, I wouldn't use high loft batting for things like table runners. And the reason my table runner that had the good example is tucked away is because you can't put anything on it without it tipping over, especially like on a dining room table, because the glasses will tip over and spill. I use it maybe sometimes decoratively, and you can put something big on it that weighs it down. Just choose your batting carefully. There are so many out there to choose from. You want to think about them and decide what you want to use. I just think that's a really important one, and because it can really change the way a quilt looks, change the way it feels. So anyway, those are the mistakes I think are big ones that, maybe not big, but those are common mistakes that quilters make, beginner and experienced alike. And I hope you can avoid them, and I hope this video was helpful. I appreciate you watching. Have a great day. Thanks.